The rhythmic, terrifying sound of Jang Tae-suk's heavy gold rings against a crystal whiskey glass was the only thing cutting through the silence of the plaza, a sound that usually preceded a death sentence. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and old rain, contrasting the predatory stillness of the Mafia boss with the chaotic, desperate heartbeat of the crowded Seoul streets. The afternoon sun in Seoul was blinding, reflecting off the glass towers like shards of ice, but Jang Tae-suk didn't blink. He stood at the center of the plaza, a $5,000 suit draped over shoulders that carried the weight of the city's underworld. His sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal the tail of a dragon tattoo, a warning to anyone who dared to breathe his air. Around him, the crowd was a blur of worship and terror, a sea of faces that knew better than to look the Dragon of Seoul in the eye. Then, the air shifted. A shadow lunged from the crowd, a snarl cutting through the silence. A fist, fueled by years of redirected hate, moved toward Tae-suk's jaw with lethal speed. The boss didn't flinch, he simply watched the impending violence with the cold curiosity of a shark. But the blow never landed. Instead, a man in a faded, grease-stained jacket threw himself into the gap. There was a sickening crack as the punch connected with the stranger's face, sending him spiraling onto the pavement at Tae-suk's feet. Tae-suk looked down, his expression unreadable as the stranger coughed, a thin trail of blood staining the white marble. The crowd froze in a collective gasp of disbelief. The Mafia boss didn't reach down to help, he simply leaned in, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I don't know you," Tae-suk whispered, his eyes scanning the man's twisted, pained face. "So tell me, why are you so eager to die for a monster like me?" The first thing Kong-woo felt wasn't pain, but a sterile, biting cold that seemed to seep directly into his bones. His eyelids felt like lead, weighted down by the lingering haze of trauma or perhaps something pharmaceutical. When they finally flickered open, he wasn't greeted by the familiar cracked ceiling of his cramped apartment. Instead, he saw the sharp, geometric lines of a high-tech medical suite, bathed in a clinical blue light that made everything look like an underwater tomb. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, localized fire flared in his jaw, radiating down his neck, a brutal reminder of the fist he had intercepted. A gloved hand pushed him back down with effortless, mechanical strength. Kong-woo's eyes darted toward the source, his heart rate beginning to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't alone. Stationed at the foot of his bed and flanking the heavy steel doors were 4 men. They didn't look like doctors. They wore tailored black tactical gear, their faces obscured by the shadows of their caps, arms crossed over chests that bore the unmistakable bulk of concealed weaponry. The air in the room was heavy, pressurized by the kind of silence that usually precedes an interrogation. Kong-woo's gaze drifted to a wide glass partition on his left. Beyond the reinforced pane, the room was dark, save for the glowing embers of a cigar. A silhouette sat there, motionless and predatory. It was the same broad-shouldered figure from the plaza, Jang Tae-suk. Even through the glass, the man's presence was suffocating. He wasn't looking at a patient, he was observing a curiosity, a specimen that had defied the natural order of the Seoul underworld. The monitor beside Kong-woo's head began to beep faster, mirroring his rising panic. He looked at his hands, pale and trembling against the expensive silk sheets. He was a nobody, a ghost in a city of millions, yet he had been brought into the inner sanctum of the most feared man in the country. One of the guards moved closer, his hand resting visibly on the holster at his hip. "Don't move," the man commanded, his voice a gravelly warning. "The boss is still deciding if you're a hero or a very clever assassin." Kong-woo swallowed hard, the metallic taste of blood still lingering on his tongue. He had stepped into the line of fire to save a life, but as he looked around the high-security cage, he realized he might have traded a quick death in the plaza for a much slower, more terrifying fate inside the dragon's lair. Through the glass, the cigar glowed brighter as Tae-suk took a slow drag, his eyes never once leaving Kong-woo's face. The silence in the room didn't break, it shattered. The heavy steel doors hissed open, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Jang Tae-suk stepped into the clinical light. He didn't move like a man, he moved like a predator that had already won the hunt. His suit was impeccable, a stark contrast to the hospital gown Kang-woo wore, which suddenly felt like a paper-thin shroud. Tae-suk stopped at the foot of the bed, his shadow stretching long and dark over Kang-woo's trembling form. For a long minute, he simply stared. His eyes were not filled with gratitude for the man who had saved his life, they were twin pools of dark glass, searching for a flaw, a hidden motive, a crack in the story. To a man like Tae-suk, a selfless act was a tactical anomaly, a variable that didn't belong in his calculated world. "You have a very strange habit of being in the wrong place at the right time," Tae-suk said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in Kang-woo's chest. He leaned forward, resting his large, scarred hands on the bed rail. "People don't just jump in front of bullets for strangers. Not in this city. Not for someone like me." Kang-woo tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I just saw the gun," he rasped, the words echoing weakly against the tiled walls. "I didn't think." Tae-suk tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips, an expression that carried no warmth. "That is exactly the problem. Instinct is either the mark of a hero or the mask of a very disciplined liar." He turned his back to Kang-woo, looking at the guards who stood like statues. "He has no criminal record. No family ties to the unions. No history of military service. He is a ghost who washes dishes and sleeps in a box." Tae-suk turned back, his gaze narrowing. The curiosity in his eyes had hardened into something more dangerous. "I don't believe in ghosts, and I certainly don't believe in coincidences. If you are an anomaly, I will find out why. If you were sent by my enemies, I will make you wish that bullet had found its mark." He snapped his fingers, and a sleek tablet was handed to him. He didn't look at Kang-woo again as he began to scroll. "Check every alley he's walked in the last 5 years. Every meal he's eaten, every person he's looked at. I want his soul laid bare on my desk by morning." With a final, chilling glance, he exited the room, leaving Kang-woo alone with the guards and the suffocating realization that his life was no longer his own. The blue light of a dozen monitors washed over Tae-suk's face, casting sharp, skeletal shadows across his features. He stood in the center of his private observation suite, arms folded, as his lead investigator laid a thick manila folder on the glass table. For hours, his team had scoured the digital and physical footprint of the man in the hospital bed, and the silence from the lead investigator spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "Nothing, sir," the man murmured, bowing his head slightly. "We've checked his tax records, his school history, even his primary school attendance. Kang-woo is exactly what he claimed to be. A day laborer. He has worked at the same docks for 3 years, lives in a sub-basement apartment in Gyeongdong, and doesn't even have a bank account with more than a few hundred won in it." Tae-suk didn't move. He didn't blink. His gaze remained fixed on a grainy CCTV still of Kang-woo carrying a heavy crate of fish. "Friends? Contacts? Everyone has a shadow, Chief Park. Show me his." "That's the anomaly, sir. He has no shadow. He doesn't drink at the local stalls. He doesn't gamble. He visits a small library twice a week and buys discounted bread at the end of the day. His neighbors describe him as the quiet boy who doesn't cause trouble. His record is so clean it's surgical." A low, dangerous sound escaped Tae-suk's throat, a laugh that carried the weight of a threat. In his world, a man with nothing to hide was the most suspicious creature of all. Perfection was a fabrication, it was a coat of paint applied to hide the rot beneath. To Tae-suk, this clean record wasn't proof of innocence, it was evidence of a masterful cover-up. No one was this boring. No one was this invisible unless they were trained to be. "You think he's a civilian," Tae-suk said, turning to look at the screen where Kang-woo sat staring at a hospital wall. But I see a man who has spent his entire life making sure he cannot be tracked. If there is no dirt on him, it means he's buried it deeper than we've dug. He tapped a finger against the glass table, the rhythm slow and deliberate. He stays. If we can't find his history in a database, we'll find it in his reactions. Move him to the guest wing of the estate. I want him under my roof, where I can watch him bleed. If he's a saint, I'll find his halo. If he's a serpent, I'll wait for him to hiss. The transition from the sterile hospital to Tae-suk's sprawling estate was a descent into a gilded cage. Kang-woo moved with a pained, mechanical gait, his ribs tightly bandaged beneath a fresh linen shirt provided by his captor. Every corner of the mansion whispered of ancient wealth and modern violence, guarded by men who looked like statues and moved like wolves. Despite the opulence, Kang-woo's eyes remained low, his posture that of a man grateful just to be standing. Tae-suk watched from the mezzanine, his predatory focus never wavering. He was waiting for a slip, a moment where the day laborer handled a weapon with too much familiarity or checked a corner with a professional's eye. But the slip came from Tae-suk's own world instead. It began with a subtle shift in the afternoon air, the distant, rhythmic thud of a heavy engine that didn't belong to the household fleet. While Tae-suk's security focused on the iron gates, Kang-woo's gaze drifted toward the service entrance. He noticed a gardener whose stride was too wide, a man whose hands didn't callous from dirt, but from the kickback of a firearm. "The tea," Kang-woo whispered, his voice cracking as he stepped toward Tae-suk, ignoring the immediate bristling of the guards. Tae-suk sneered, descending the stairs. "What about it, laborer? Is it not to your peasant standards?" "The man who brought the tray," Kang-woo said, his voice trembling, not with fear of Tae-suk, but with an urgent, cold clarity. "He didn't bow to the house shrine. He's left-handed, but he's wearing his holster on the right. And he's not looking at you. He's looking at the ventilation ducts." Before Tae-suk could respond with a mockery, the glass dome above the foyer shattered. Black-clad figures rappelled from the ceiling, the air instantly filling with the deafening chatter of submachine guns. Tae-suk's men reacted, but they were a second too slow, the infiltration had already been seeded from within. In the chaos, a stray bullet grazed the banister inches from Tae-suk's head. He felt a rough, powerful hand shove him toward the floor. It was Kang-woo. The simple laborer was no longer cowering, he was shielding Tae-suk with his own battered body, his eyes scanning the room with a terrifying, calculated precision. "Get down," Kang-woo hissed, the stutter in his voice gone. Tae-suk looked up from the marble floor, seeing the blood soak through Kang-woo's white shirt. The debt was no longer just about a hospital bill. It was written in the red staining the floor, and for the first time, Tae-suk felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine uncertainty. The smoke from the skirmish had barely cleared when Tae-suk dragged Kang-woo into the soundproofed depths of the mansion's lower level. The air here was cold, smelling of ozone and old secrets. Kang-woo was shoved into a steel chair, his breath hitching as his fresh wounds protested the rough handling. Tae-suk didn't use a chair, he paced like a caged tiger, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the concrete walls. "No more games," Tae-suk spat, the tip of a switchblade catching the overhead light as it flicked open. He pressed the cold steel against Kang-woo's throat, just firm enough to beat a drop of crimson. A day laborer doesn't spot a professional mole by the way he bows. A peasant doesn't throw himself into gunfire with the tactical posture of a disciplined soldier. "Who sent you? Was it the Guriong Syndicate? Are you the blade they hid in my own garden?" Kang-woo looked up, his eyes dull with pain but lacking any flicker of the subservient fear he had performed earlier. He didn't flinch against the blade. "I wasn't sent by anyone, Tae-suk. I came because I had to see if the boy was still there." Tae-suk's hand trembled slightly, a rare crack in his composure. "What boy?" 20 years ago, Kang-woo whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping pavement. "The fire at the orphans' district. The rafters were screaming, and the smoke was thick enough to choke the devil. Everyone ran out, but one boy was trapped behind a fallen beam in the storage room. He was small, covered in soot, clutching a wooden dragon like it was a shield. Tae-suk froze. The blade didn't move, but his eyes widened, the pupils blowing wide. That fire was the ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun, the night he had nearly died before a stranger pulled him from the inferno. The man who saved him, Kang-woo continued, his gaze boring into Tae-suk's soul, had a dragon tattooed across his back, identical to the one on the boy's toy. The boy promised that man he would owe him a debt of blood. He promised that if the man ever came back, he would be his sword. Kang-woo leaned forward, letting the knife edge cut a shallow line into his skin. I'm not your enemy, Tae-suk. I'm the man with the tattoo. And I've come to see if you're a man who keeps his promises, or if you become the very monster we were hiding from that night. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 2 decades. Tae-suk slowly retracted the blade, his breathing ragged, looking at the broken man before him not as a captive, but as a mirror he was terrified to look into. The roar of the fire was a sound that never truly left Kang-woo's nightmares. In the memory, the world was orange and screaming. The orphanage, a crumbling structure that had been his only shelter, was being devoured by a hungry, chemical heat. While others fled into the night, Kang-woo, younger then, but already possessed by a desperate sense of duty, had turned back. He hadn't been looking for riches, he had been looking for the small, quiet boy who always hid in the corners. He found him in the storage room. The air was a thick, toxic soup that clawed at his throat. A massive support beam had buckled, pinning the child's legs beneath a rain of sparks and heavy timber. The boy was white-faced, his knuckles bloodless as he gripped a small wooden dragon. He wasn't crying, he was simply waiting for the end with a terrifying, hollow acceptance. Kang-woo didn't think. He threw his weight against the burning wood. The heat was an physical wall, melting the very fabric of his shirt onto his skin. He felt his flesh blister and hiss as the beam shifted, the agony so blinding that he almost lost consciousness. But he didn't stop. With a final, guttural roar, he heaved the weight off the boy and shielded him with his own body as the roof began to collapse. By the time he dragged the boy through the back exit and collapsed into the wet grass, the damage was done. His back was a map of ruin, angry, weeping third-degree burns that would never truly heal. When he eventually woke in a back-alley clinic weeks later, the doctor told him he would carry the marks of the Red Dragon forever. He hadn't chosen the tattoo out of vanity or a desire to look like a gangster. He had chosen it because the scars were a grotesque reminder of a debt that could never be paid, a jagged landscape of raised skin that made him flinch when he looked in a mirror. The ink was a shroud. He had spent months under the needle, the artist's ink masking the scorched history of his sacrifice. Every scale of the dragon was a shield over a memory of pain, a way to turn a mark of victimhood into a symbol of power. He had become the dragon so that the boy wouldn't have to remember the fire every time he looked at his savior. He had chosen to be the monster so the child could remain human. The atmosphere in the penthouse had shifted from the clinical chill of an interrogation to something far more volatile and confusing. Tae-suk didn't offer apologies, men like him didn't have the vocabulary for regret, but the change in his behavior was unmistakable. He no longer stood over Kang-woo with a blade, instead, he watched from the shadows of the room as a private medical team treated the man he had nearly broken. The soldiers stood guard in the hallway, their whispers buzzing like hornets. They had seen Tae-suk execute men for much less than the defiance Kang-woo had shown. Yet, when a young lieutenant entered the room to suggest moving the prisoner back to the holding cells, Tae-suk's response was a terrifying, quiet violence. He hadn't raised his voice, but the way he gripped the subordinate's collar, eyes burning with a protective ferocity, sent a clear message. Kang-woo was no longer a captive. He was something else entirely. He eats what I eat, Tae-suk commanded, his voice rasping. And if another hand touches him without my say, I'll personally ensure that hand never holds a weapon again. The respect was rough, carved out of the jagged edges of their shared, scorched past. Tae-suk stayed by the bedside late into the night, the weight of the wooden dragon in his pocket feeling heavier than any pistol. He watched the rhythmic rise and fall of Kong-woo's chest, his gaze fixated on the ink that masked the tragedy of his own survival. To his men, this was emotional contamination, a weakness that could bleed the empire dry. They saw a boss who had lost his edge to a ghost from the past. But for Tae-suk, it was a desperate attempt to reconcile the monster he had become with the boy who had once been saved by a hero. He wasn't just tending to a man's wounds, he was trying to stop his own soul from hemorrhaging. Every time he looked at Kong-woo, the cold, calculated walls of his world cracked a little further, letting in a light he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold, metallic tang of unspoken threats. 6 men sat around the obsidian table, their faces etched with the kind of pragmatism that had no room for sentiment. These were the architects of the syndicate, the ones who viewed people as assets or liabilities, and to them, the broken man resting in Tae-suk's private quarters was the greatest liability they had encountered in a decade. He has seen the layout of the upper levels. He has heard the names of our logistics partners. He has looked into your eyes, Tae-suk, and seen something other than a killer, the eldest director said, his voice a dry rasp. The board is unanimous. The contamination must be purged. Kong-woo is a witness to the inner sanctum. He must be removed. Tae-suk didn't lean back. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table like carved stone. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing against the chests of every man in the room. In the past, Tae-suk would have nodded, executed the order, and moved on to the next expansion. But the memory of the fire, the heat that had never truly left his bones, refused to let him speak the words of betrayal. He is not a witness, Tae-suk said finally, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous resonance. He is my debt. And in this organization, we honor our debts. This isn't about honor, it's about survival, a younger director countered, his bravado masking a tremor in his hand. The men are talking. They say you've gone soft for a ghost. If you won't do it, we will send someone who can. Tae-suk rose slowly, the movement fluid and predatory. He walked to the head of the table, leaning down until he was inches from the director's face. The light from the city below caught the jagged scar on his neck, making it pulse with his heartbeat. If any man enters my quarters without my invitation, Tae-suk whispered, they won't find a liability. They will find a grave. The board governs the business. I govern the blood. Do not confuse the two again. He turned and walked out, leaving the directors in a stunned, simmering silence. He knew he had just declared war on his own foundation, but as he stepped into the elevator, his only thought was of the man upstairs. For the first time in his life, the empire felt like a cage, and the only person who held the key was the one they wanted him to kill. The morning arrived with a deceptive calm, the sun bleeding through the panoramic windows of the penthouse. Tae-suk was interrupted from his vigil by Elder Min, his oldest advisor and the man who had practically raised him within the syndicate's shadows. Min did not come with tea or reports, he came with a tablet and a grim set to his jaw. On the screen was a decrypted communication log, showing a series of outgoing pings from a burner phone located within Tae-suk's private suite, messages directed to a rival faction's encrypted server. It was hidden in the lining of the boy's coat, the one he was wearing when you brought him here, Min said, his voice heavy with feigned disappointment. He wasn't just a survivor of the fire, Tae-suk. He was a plant. A sleeper agent sent to wait for the moment your guilt made you vulnerable. He has been transmitting our security rotations for the last 48 hours. Tae-suk took the device, his thumb tracing the digital trail of betrayal. It was perfect. Too perfect. The logs were detailed, the timing aligned with the moments he had left Kong-woo alone to attend to business. In the corner of the room, Kong-woo sat by the window, his frame still fragile, his eyes hollow as he stared at the skyline. He looked less like a master spy and more like a man whose soul had been hollowed out by grief. He is a ghost, Tae-suk, Min pressured, stepping closer, his hand resting on the younger man's shoulder. The board was right. He is the crack in your armor. Kill him now, and we can tell the directors you were merely playing a long game to find the source of the leak. Tae-suk looked from the cold, blue light of the screen to the warm, flickering life in Kong-woo's eyes. The evidence screamed traitor, but the silence in the room screamed lie. He remembered the way Kong-woo's hand had trembled when he reached for water, a tremor that couldn't be faked by even the most seasoned operative. He felt the weight of 20 years of Min's guidance on one side, and the inexplicable pull of a shared tragedy on the other. You've never been wrong before, Min, Tae-suk said softly, his hand moving toward the pistol holstered at his hip. Min's eyes glinted with a dark satisfaction. But as Tae-suk stood, he didn't turn toward the boy. He turned toward the tablet, smashing it against the edge of the obsidian table. But then again, you've never had to compete with a debt of blood. Find the real source of the phone, or don't come back to this floor. The dismissal of Elder Min was a crack in the foundation that Tae-suk hadn't expected to widen so quickly. The penthouse, once a fortress of silent luxury, suddenly felt like a glass cage. The betrayal didn't come from the shadows or the rival families, it came from the man standing at the elevator bank, the one who held the keys to the syndicate's armory. Jin-ho, Tae-suk's second-in-command, stepped into the living area not with a report, but with a drawn suppressed pistol. Behind him, 3 of the household's elite guards followed, their eyes averted from the man they had sworn to protect. The silence of the room was punctured by the rhythmic clicking of the safeties being disengaged. Min was a fool to try and frame the boy with digital ghosts, Jin-ho said, his voice devoid of its usual deference. He thought he could manipulate you back into being the boss the board wanted. But I know you better, Tae-suk. You're compromised. You've been looking for a way out since the day you set that fire, and this stranger is the door you're planning to walk through. Tae-suk didn't reach for his gun, he moved instinctively toward the window where Kong-woo sat. The boy had stood up, his face pale but his hands remarkably still. You're throwing away a decade of loyalty for a seat that will kill you in a year, Jin-ho, Tae-suk replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I'm taking what I earned while you were busy mourning a family that isn't yours, Jin-ho spat. He leveled the barrel at Kong-woo's chest. First, I'll kill the ghost. Then, I'll kill the king who forgot how to rule. The first shot shattered a crystal vase inches from Kong-woo's head. Tae-suk lunged, his body acting as a human shield as he tackled the boy to the floor behind the heavy obsidian table. The room erupted in a chaotic symphony of breaking glass and suppressed thuds. Tae-suk felt a searing heat across his shoulder, a graze, but enough to draw blood. In the mess of flying splinters, he looked at Kong-woo. For the first time, the hollow look in the boy's eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, terrifying clarity. Kong-woo reached out, grabbing Tae-suk's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been there. He's right, the stranger whispered amid the gunfire. You are weak because of me. But they are wrong about who I am. Tae-suk realized then that the betrayal had stripped away everyone's masks. He wasn't just fighting for his empire anymore, he was fighting to keep the only piece of his soul he had left alive, even as the walls of his life came crashing down around them. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of cordite and ozone as the emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the chaos in a rhythmic, crimson pulse. Tae-suk pressed his back against the cold obsidian of the table, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. Beside him, Kong-woo was a shadow, silent, watchful, and devoid of the tremors that should have plagued a boy caught in a crossfire. The betrayal had stripped away the luxury of the estate, leaving only the raw, jagged edges of survival. They're moving to the flank, Kong-woo whispered, his voice cutting through the ringing in Tae-suk's ears. He wasn't looking at the shooters, he was looking at the reflection in a shattered floor-to-ceiling mirror. The one with the scar is signaling for a breach from the balcony. If they get through that door, we're trapped. Tae-suk glanced at the boy, a grim realization settling in his gut. The stranger wasn't just a guest or a ghost, he was a tactician. Reaching into the waistband of his trousers, Tae-suk pulled out a secondary sidearm, a sleek, compact semi-automatic, and held it out. "Can you use this?" Kang-woo didn't hesitate. He took the weapon with a practiced ease that sent a chill down Tae-suk's spine. "Don't aim for where they are," the boy said, his eyes locking onto Tae-suk's with an intensity that burned. "Aim for where they have to go." As the balcony doors shattered inward under a hail of gunfire, the two moved in a brutal, unspoken synchrony. Tae-suk provided the heavy suppression, his shots calculated and rhythmic, forcing Jin-ho's men to dive for cover. Behind his shield, Kang-woo moved like a phantom. He didn't fire wildly, he waited for the half-second of exposure, his shots finding the narrow gaps in the tactical vests with terrifying precision. The siege intensified as Jin-ho realized his easy coup was turning into a slaughter. "Finish them," he screamed from the hallway, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of an exploding gas line in the kitchen area. Amidst the smoke and the heat, Tae-suk felt a strange, surging adrenaline. He was no longer a king defending a throne, he was a soldier fighting alongside a brother in arms he barely knew. When a guard lunged from the smoke with a combat knife, Tae-suk didn't have time to pivot, but a single shot from Kang-woo's pistol dropped the man instantly. "Behind you!" Tae-suk roared, grabbing Kang-woo's collar and pulling him down as a spray of bullets raked the wall where his head had been. They were pinned, outnumbered, and the floor was slick with blood, but for the first time in years, Tae-suk didn't feel alone. They were a two-man army in a burning palace, and the counterstrike had only just begun. The aftermath of the siege was a symphony of sirens and the heavy scent of settling dust. In the charred remains of the penthouse, Tae-suk looked at Kang-woo, whose face was illuminated by the dying embers of the library. They both knew the truth, as long as Kang-woo was seen at Tae-suk's side, he would be a target for every ghost in the underworld. The Dragon of the Seoul syndicate had to make a choice, not as a boss, but as a man who had finally found something worth protecting more than power. The plan was executed with the brutal efficiency of a master chess player. Before the reinforcements arrived, Tae-suk set the final stage. He pulled a body from the wreckage, a fallen insurgent of similar build, and placed his own signet ring on the corpse's hand before dousing the corner in accelerant. By the time the fire department quelled the flames, the world was told that the mysterious stranger who had aided the boss had perished in the blast. To the syndicate, he was a nameless casualty. To the police, he was a ghost returned to the ether. Weeks later, the air in a small coastal village outside of Jeju was salt-crusted and sweet. Far from the obsidian towers and blood-stained marble of the city, a young man sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the harbor. Kang-woo looked different, the sharp, haunted edge in his eyes had softened into a quiet curiosity. He wore a simple linen shirt, his hands, once wrapped around the grip of a cold semi-automatic, now held a book of poetry. He was no longer a weapon or a pawn. He was simply a man, nameless and free. High on a cliffside road, a black sedan sat idling, its windows tinted deep enough to hide the soul within. Inside, Tae-suk watched through binoculars, his finger tracing the scar on his palm. He saw Kang-woo smile at a passing merchant, a genuine, effortless expression that Tae-suk had never seen in the penthouse. It was the smile of someone who had forgotten the sound of a chambered round. Tae-suk lowered the glasses and signaled the driver. He didn't need to speak. The hollow ache that had defined his life for 32 years had been replaced by a heavy, grounding peace. He had given up his greatest ally to save the boy's soul, and in doing so, he had found his own. As the car pulled away, leaving the village behind, the boss leaned back into the shadows, a ghost protecting a dream from the distance. The war was over, and for the first time, the dragon slept without fire in his heart.